Hey everyone, welcome to Equitable Growth's Grantee Conference and to our session on firms and wage inequality. So this session will dig into the role individual firms play in determining wages and either perpetuating economic inequality or potentially pushing back against economic inequality across the labor market. So first we will have a presentation by Ingrid Hegele from University of California, Berkeley on hidden talents, managers, applications, and the gender gap. Followed by that, we'll have David Weil of Brandeis University presenting on wage ripples in the labor market, spillover effects of voluntary wage hikes. His co-author, Alora Darnancourt, is also an attendee of this session, so she'll be able to chime in on the chat function for other people who are attendees. Following that, we'll have discussion comments by Johanna Schmieder of Boston University. After that, we'll have Nathan Wilmers give a presentation on his work. Nathan Wilmers, MIT, give a presentation on his work of Consolidated Advantage, the new organizational dynamics of wage inequality, with discussion comments of Siwei Cheng from New York University. And so each presentation will run about 10 minutes long with a similar amount of time for discussant comments. And followed by that, we're hoping to have about 20 minutes at the end for Q&A, and people can use the Q&A, the chat function on the platform to put questions in for the Q&A. All right, so with that, thank you very much, Ingrid. I'll hand it off to you.
Great. Thank you so much for having me and for supporting my work on gender gaps and career progression. So despite large improvements in female labor force participation, women are still vastly underrepresented in top positions. For example, in large firms in the US, women represent almost half of all employees, but hold only 6% of CEO positions. And today I want to highlight a key channel for this gender gap in representation, which is career progression within firms. And that's motivated by the observation that firm tenures are really long. Like nearly half of mid-career workers in the US have been with their firms for over 10 years, implying that career progression within firms is very important for worker outcomes. And unfortunately, we know that very little about internal labor markets because it's hard to collect data on what's going on within firms. But you might expect that men and women might differ with respect to career progression. So in this paper, I'm trying to understand to what extent organizational practices differentially affect men and women, and how we could mitigate gender differences in representation by adjusting these practices. And I'm tackling these questions by collecting a novel data set in collaboration with a large manufacturer, employing hundreds of thousands of employees. And today I'm going to focus on the firm's white-collar and management employees in Germany. So this captures over 200 typical occupations, ranging from engineering to marketing and sales to HR and finance. And the firm's employees are pretty representative of the German workforce. And I want to flag one key institutional feature of the internal labor market that's very common among large firms. So many organizations require the employees to actively apply in order to make an internal transition. That means if you want to get promoted, you have to go to the online job portal of the firm, find a job opening, apply, get hired. And most of the internal applications are going to be for positions outside of employees' current teams. And this allows me to collect data on the universe of application hiring decisions at the firm. This means at each point in time, I see which employees apply for which job openings, who receives a callback, a rejection, an offer, etc. And this really represents a major contribution of the paper because I'm going to be able to separately analyze labor supply and labor demand factors for promotions. So the first thing I do in the paper is to derive new stylized facts on the internal labor market. So I find that women are vastly underrepresented at higher level positions at the firm, and this is driven by gender gaps in internal promotions. In contrast, I find that no evidence that differential entry to the firm or exit from the firm play a role. I find also no gender gap in lateral transitions, only with respect to promotions. And I try to understand what might be driving these gender differences in promotions. I separately analyze applications for promotions and hiring decisions for promotions. And I find that women are 26% less likely to apply for promotions than similar men. And this difference cannot be explained by covariates, like part-time, family status, etc. However, among the workers who choose to apply, women are not less likely to get hired than men. And this suggests that it's really these differences in application behavior that are translating into gaps in representation. So in order to identify how could women's applications be increased, I'm going to take a closer look at the talent development practices at the firm. And most organizations rely on direct supervisors to identify talents in their teams and encourage them to apply for promotions. But usually managers are not rewarded for this. So you can imagine then if the talented subordinates leave a team, the manager bears the cost of having to replace them. This implies managers have an incentive to hide talent, prompting a moral hazard problem at the firm. And you can imagine this incentive to hide talent might have negative consequences on workers' applications. And I conducted a survey with the employees in my sample that received the 50% response rate and is really representative of the workers in my sample. And 41% of workers report fearing retaliation by the manager if they find out about the applications. So it really seems managers have a negative impact on workers' decisions to apply. And many workers report testimonials like, my manager discouraged me from applying or blocked my career progression. This highlights the potential for this friction. And while it's pretty intuitive that talent hiding might occur and might have big impacts, to my knowledge, this is the first paper to evaluate this friction. I'm going to do so by using quasi-random variation in employees' exposure to manager rotation. Where manager rotation is an event where a manager leaves her team to make an internal transition within the firm as part of her own career progression. So you can think about this variation as induced by the manager and having nothing to do with the worker or the team. And so in the paper, I conduct several validity exercises, and I show that these rotation events are as good as randomly assigned. So what should we expect if managers rotate? Manager rotation kind of temporarily eliminates managers' impact on workers. So if it's really about talent hiding and managers deterred workers' application beforehand, we should expect that as soon as managers announce the departure, workers should increase the applications. Because even if the manager will find out they will be gone soon, and the worker doesn't have to bear the consequences. And I can actually see in my data when managers themselves find out about the rotation, because they have to apply as well. So on average, 2 to 3 quarters before they rotate, they will find out if they got the job. And there's a very strict policy at the firm that managers have to tell their teams as soon as possible. So we should expect like an uptick in applications 2 to 3 quarters before, but this should go away as soon as the new manager comes in. And I'll show you in a second, this is exactly what we see in the data. And I'm going to show you only one graph today, but this really boils down the intuition of the paper. So these are results from an event study regression where the outcome of interest is an indicator for workers' applications for internal job openings. And each coefficient is based on an event time dummy, where event time is measured in quarters. And at time 0, the manager that rotates leaves her team to make an internal transition. So you can see a couple of things in this figure, like one, managers have a huge impact on workers' applications. Like at time 0, when the manager rotates, it basically doubles workers' applications, which is a really big magnitude. Second, you see this uptick I mentioned earlier, like up to 3 quarters before. This is when I see in the data the managers find out about the outcome of their job transition and start informing their subordinates. But you see before that, when managers didn't know they're going to rotate, there are very flat pre-trends, kind of encouraging the validity of the design. You can also see after the rotation happens that applications go back to baseline really quickly, as soon as the new manager comes in. And this suggests this is really driven by the outgoing manager, not the incoming. I should also flag that these applications are virtually all to positions outside of employees' current teams and not to teams where the manager is going to rotate. So it's not the case that managers are just taking people with them. So I hope one thing you can take away today is that managers have really big implications on workers' application decisions. And in the paper, I actually go one step further and provide direct evidence that this impact is driven by talent hiding. So I use an explicit measure of talent hiding practices I derive from talent development systems at the firm. I use heterogeneity by cost and show the costlier it is for a manager if the workers leave, the more they hide, the bigger the impact. And I'm able to rule out alternative explanations such as worker loyalty or match effects. I show that talent hiding deters a large group of workers from applying, and these workers are really qualified. So they're not going to apply to promotions, and that kind of suggests that talent hiding causes misallocation of talent, because they're really good workers who don't apply, but they wouldn't have gotten the job. They would have gotten the jobs, they would have done really well. When comparing men and women, I find that the women who are affected are more women are affected and they're of higher ability. And I find women leave more money on the table, so to speak. So the women are gonna forego high stakes applications for promotions. They were much more likely to get than comparable men for positions in which they would outperform their male counterparts. So really, they forego really big career progression impacts. And I can also use my design to ask what would happen if you could eliminate talent hiding for marginal applicants. And I find that eliminating talent hiding would shrink the gap in representation by 91% and reduce the pay gap by 77%, which suggests that this friction in particular and applications in general play a really big role for gender inequality at the firm. So just to like wrap up, maybe this was too fast, but this paper,
you're right, we have 1 minute left.
This paper makes two major contributions. I collect a novel data set that allows me to look at the dynamics of the internal labor market, especially separately analyzing labor supply and labor demand. And I provide new evidence on an important friction, which is talent hiding, that not only causes misallocation of talent, but also contributes to gender inequality. And my results suggest by adjusting these talent practices and eliminating the negative impact of talent hiding, we could both shrink gender inequality and substantially increase female representation in higher positions. And that's what I'm working on right now, where we're trying to design interventions to be conducted in the firm to test which policies in practice are most effective at implementing this. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Ingrid. Super interesting data. And next we have David Weil. You are currently on mute if you've tried to speak. There you go.
How about now? Okay.
Yeah.
Rookie mistake. Okay, thank you. And I'm delighted to be here and present a paper on spillovers from voluntary employer minimum wages. It's a joint work with Elora Duranencourt, Berkeley, who is with us in the audience, and also with Clemens Nolka. We are also grateful for Equitable Growth for their support of this project. Just to motivate what we're doing, since 2012, there has been pressures from worker advocates unions to raise wages paid to low-wage workers. This push has been exemplified by the Fight for 15 movement that's really had two prongs. One is to raise statutory minimum wages at the state level. And secondly, there has been pressure on individual companies to raise their entry wages. And this chart just looks at from January 2014 to 2020, how these increases have played out. The gray lines are individual states and their successive increases in state minimum wages over this period of time. But really the focus of this paper is on the dots. The dots are major companies that have also adopted voluntary minimum wages over this same period. And we're looking at particularly three major retailers that together employ about 2 million workers, Walmart, Target, and Amazon. I'm going to focus the results I'll talk mostly about today on the Amazon effects, which were instituted October 2018. Amazon announced that all entry wages for all employees at any Amazon distribution center facility or Whole Foods, which they came to own, would be a $15 minimum. So we'll look at that in particular. What the real research question we want to understand here is really not so much the effect directly on the company's own employees, but how those increases affected wages set by other employers in local labor markets where those companies, Amazon and others, are located. Did the increase in the voluntary minimum wage of Amazon induce changes in wage determination of other employers in those labor markets? First thing we're going to use Burning Glass technology data which provides millions of data points on job postings that give you time-stamped employer, occupation, and wage information that's pertinent to this question of who responded to the Amazon increases. And it gives us a way of understanding the dynamics in these individual labor markets in terms of the nature of responses. Just to, first of all, show that these the Amazon effects weren't just talk, they were real. Using burning glass technology, this will just give you a sense over time of the percentage of postings by Amazon that were in different wage bins. And an important line to look at in this figure is the dark blue line, the line that looks like it's hovers around 80% of all postings being below $15 an hour up until the announcement October 2018, where you see the posted wages above 15 goes down dramatically. And by July of 2019, essentially Amazon is posting no jobs at that. So this just illustrates we're looking at a very real effect of Amazon on its own pay structure. And now the question is, how did it play out for other employers in those local labor markets? To do that, what we're going to do is look at a specific way of not only taking the timestamp, the October 18th date in an event framework as the key change, the key experiment here, but also look at what we call the bite, drawing from the minimum wage literature, the percent of these other employers who were paying below $15 in the period prior to the Amazon announcement, with the theory that the larger the percentage of a labor force of an employer was being paid below 15, the larger the impact it would be to be now working in a labor market where Amazon had raised it. And just to give you a sense of the distribution, the variation in this outcome, this just graphs the percentage of what we're calling exposure, the percentage of wages paid by employers below $15 prior to the Amazon announcement in different commuting zones across the country. And this is our real measure of impact interacted with the October 2018 date. And what you can see, overall, the mean is about 58% of the wages were being paid below $15 an hour prior to the October 2018 date. So using that as the basis, we then constructed an event study framework where we look at the size of that effect, also introducing fixed effects for occupation by time, commuting zone by time, as fixed effects to absorb confounding factors that might otherwise explain how, for a given cell of a specific firm with a specific job, how that was affecting the response by these other employers. And let me just present the core results here. This is a plot that looks at the estimated coefficients on the fraction affected by the degree of exposure they are to the Amazon increase. Prior to the announcement, you can see the estimates center around 0. There's no real pre-trend here, but immediately following the Amazon announcement, you see appreciable increases in the wages paid. These are measured in log wages by other employers in those local labor markets where Amazon is present. We normalize this result to give a sense of how much of an increase does this represent. And the normalized level represents about a 4.7% increase in the wages paid by other employers in labor markets where Amazon's present over this ensuing period after the announcement of the Amazon increase. And the results are robust to specification. We actually construct a similar experiment using Glassdoor data that's worker reported data We find basically the same effects in terms of magnitude and significance. We've also recreated this with other employers. I mentioned that Target and Walmart had a succession of increases over the same period of time. These are plots of just the same estimation strategy of different events at different periods of time over this era where we've had all of these voluntary minimum wage increases. And what's striking is you can see comparable effects in terms of the sign. The size varies in terms of really how big was the wage increase, the voluntary increase relative to the labor market. So that will give you a sense of the overall effects of the response. Second, we're interested in the nature of this response. How, is this, even with the fixed effects we've entered into the model, one could still say, well, maybe there's something else going on, a tightening of the labor market beyond this that we're somehow picking up in all of these experiments. One way to probe that question is to look specifically as what are employers actually doing in terms of specific wages.
David, you have 2 minutes left.
Okay, we look at that. This is just an experiment looking at the probability that individual employers raise wages at $15, $16, and so on. And what you can see is the predominant response is to match the employer increase that Amazon has done. In other words, to match the $15 an hour is clearly the most likely response. And again, we see the same pattern of behavior for the other retailers who did voluntary wage increases. This is just a plot of we sort of to calculate magnitudes. We estimate the cross-employer wage elasticities implied by these changes. Overall, for the Amazon case I've been talking about, our best estimate is that cross-wage elasticity is about 0.22. So a 10% increase in the Amazon wage raises wages in the surrounding labor markets by about 2.2%, which is again a very big number. I'm not going to have time to talk in great specificity about this, but clearly one of the questions is, if they're raising their wages, what happens to their employment? And the paper looks into this question. Here we use CPS because Burning Glass or Glassdoor doesn't have employment information. We use CPS. We basically instrument using occupational exposure to the Amazon increase rather than employer exposure to recreate our basic result. That's what you see in this figure. Even with CPS, using a less direct measure built around the occupation, we find not only the same size, the same direction of the effect, but basically the same magnitude. We then use CPS to look at, in the same way, estimate what are the employment effects in those labor markets where there's been this exposure. What we find is, while we get noisy results, our findings are that there is a negative impact on employment subsequent to the announcement, again, holding constant other factors. This is, again, a measure using all the different experiments. What are the relative size of the wage effects? And you can see, not surprisingly, the bigger the voluntary minimum wage increase is, the larger the estimate of the effects are. However, the size of the effects we're measuring are pretty comparable to what we're finding in the minimum wage literature. And that is employment elasticities in our own estimates of around negative 0.11. Those are the two you see at the top of this graph. We're showing that that's very much in keeping with the small magnitudes other people have measured in terms of minimum wage increases. So in conclusion, I think what we take away from this is there are substantial local spillover effects from these voluntary minimum wage increases. That those spillover effects vary by the size of the bite, how much other employers are being pushed to raise their wages as a result of the relative impact of an Amazon or a Walmart impact. We find there are some employment effects, saying firms really are responding to this. We can talk some about differences across firms in those responses. but they're minimal. They're sort of in keeping with what we know from the minimum wage literature. And going forward, what we're really focusing now on is to really understand what's happening in terms of worker movement as a result of these changes. We want to understand more about other factors that might moderate the impact of employer responses to these big employers. And then finally, we think there's a lot of policy implications to what we're finding in terms of larger efforts to influence wage structures through interventions, voluntary or mandatory, as through public policies. Thank you.
Thanks, David. And for discussant comments, we have Johannes Schmieder.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so it has been a great pleasure to look over both of these papers, and I think they're both really fascinating. They're different papers, but I feel I learned a lot. So I'm going to talk briefly about both of them. So let's start with Ingrid's paper. So I wanted to start by just a table that actually one of my colleagues at BU presented last Friday on the gender pay gap in Germany that I thought kind of fits this paper very well. And these are just estimates basically of simple regression estimates of the gender wage gap in Germany for full-time workers. And one thing that they did here, so this is kind of the raw unadjusted wage gap of about 25 log points, which it's a very similar order of magnitude as in the US. And then you can see we can sort of add in subsequent controls. And then in the last column, what they did is they added occupation by firm fixed effects or establishment fixed effects. So this is basically saying like, within an occupation, and these are like 5-digit occupations, so these are very specific occupations, like research economist, by firm, are there wage differences between men and women? And even when we have these very, very detailed fixed effects, we still see about a 13 log point wage gap in Germany. Now, and that then in turn raises the question, why is that? And I think the paper by Ingrid here has a real potential to make us, allow us to understand this a lot better than what we do otherwise. There's another graph as background I wanted to show. So there's something I just produced myself, but using, again, kind of administrative data from Germany, just looking at the wage profiles of men and women. And one sees this sort of striking pattern that, as men and women, start out, somewhat similarly, one really sees sort of that, later in life, big gaps, open up and they become bigger and bigger as people become older, right? And now this is not controlling for anything, so there's a lot of stuff going on here. But Ingrid sort of points at this possibility that women are just even conditional on basically having the same employer and the same type of job as men, are just much less likely to get promoted, and therefore really struggle to sort of reach kind of the high levels of firm hierarchies where the earnings are the highest. And so, these are very substantial wage differences and earnings differences. And so this paper really has something interesting, I think, to contribute. I think when we think about sort of these substantial pay gaps within firms, there are a number of kind of hypotheses that people think about when they see this table I showed before. And I think so the main things is that in most data sets, it's hard to really know how many hours people are working. And certainly in Germany, it's quite common for people to work like 80%, 90%, even when they are technically considered full-time. And in most data that you can't really distinguish that. You might only know that somebody's working full-time, but really they might be working 10% less because of childcare and there's certainly gender gaps in that. And so having a data set that really allows us to understand that better, I think is quite important. And then Ingrid really focuses on this idea of the position being important, so the position in the firm hierarchy. And I think intuitively that makes a lot of sense. And then finally, we of course always have in the back of our mind that there's sort of this issue: do we really have equal pay for equal work, or is it different pay for equal work? And I think here's sort of a nice way of sort of getting a sense of this. And kind of the really starting baseline for this paper is that she has this fascinating data set from a large anonymous manufacturing company in Germany. There's several 100,000 workers, and there's very detailed information in the internal labor market of this firm in terms of position titles, team compositions, And then especially when there are openings for positions in that firm, she can observe both vacancies and application information for these internal hires. And then she also has performance evaluations by managers, which is something we don't have when we go to like administrative social security data. Then we only have a fraction of that. And so, but on the one hand, it's of course only one firm. It's a very large firm and it has like this, extremely rich data, which I think is extremely helpful. And kind of the key highlights fact sheet of documents are that as we move up the firm hierarchy, there are fewer and fewer women. Women are much less likely to apply for promotions than men, which I don't think we really knew before, at least not from data like this. And there's a large, and that in turn then explains the large share of the gender pay gap, since we have so many fewer women at the higher levels of the firm hierarchy. And so this is kind of documented in the data, and then there's this nice experimental or sort of quasi-experimental design that when managers rotate out, that leads to sort of a boost of promotion applications by both men and women. And in those situations, it really seems like the gender gap goes away, and women are much more likely to apply, and then they're much more likely to actually get promoted. And so this kind of sort of by accident that this happens. I mentioned this is not the goal of the manager rotation policy, but it sort of opens up sort of a lot of interesting insights into what might be holding back women. So in terms of comments and suggestions, I think I would really I think the paper could benefit a lot from having these stylized facts in more figures. So I think pictures have more than 1,000 words, and also certainly then regression tables. And I think a lot of graphs could be shown via figures. So just for example, you have sort of this measure of the firm hierarchy. You could show what is the share of women, by percentiles of the firm hierarchy or by percentile of the firm's earnings distribution. So just to sort of illustrate it, I created a figure that shows the, again, this is just in Germany, sort of in a cross section of the population. What is the share of women at percentiles of the earnings distribution or the wage distribution of full-time workers? And this sort of gives you a sense that there's sort of this declining pattern, right? That basically at the very highest percentiles of the wage distribution, there are very few women. And this is not within firm, but I think it would be really nice to do this within your firm, right? Something like that. And I think it is just an example. I think a lot of the data is so rich. I think you could do a lot of things that you right now do in tables and sort of in the text in these kind of figures. And I think this would be much more, people are much more likely to remember it, say, 2 months from now if they've seen a figure like that. And I think you could do this sort of in different ways. I also thought, like, you mentioned that women are much less likely to apply and then to be promoted. You could show basically hazard plots where you show the probability of applying or the probability of promoting, by age or by firm tenure for both men and women. And that would really be sort of very nice visual illustration of this gender gap. And then you could sort of link that in anything with your shock. So and then also just showing the gender pay gap by tenure or age would also be very nice. It's kind of similar to to this figure right here, but do this basically within the firm. And then I thought more generally, it wasn't, maybe I missed that, but it wasn't clear to me whether you observe hours that people work. And I think just looking a bit more at sort of these different sort of dimensions that all have, you're basically linking it a bit more to sort of the basic questions people have about the gender gap, and so showing more what's the role within the firm, I think would be quite nice. I also thought that you could maybe think a bit about parental leave, although maybe that would be like a separate paper. I don't think I have much time left. So the third thing is, you have these performance measures, and I think that is really fascinating. It also seemed to me like that was maybe the most work in progress part. I would have liked to just see a lot more about that. So you mentioned you have these predicted potential measure, as well as the performance measure that's more about past performance, and just showing more what really is going on here and what is the gender gap, in both of those. I thought would be super fascinating, and it's a little bit hidden in the way you do it. I think you basically just use the difference between the two. But I thought that it's just a very nice feature of the data. And then, the fourth thing is about the manager rotations. I thought it would be very nice if you could do all of this in an event study design, right? And you have sort of glimpses of that in this kind of figure. And I just wondered whether you could basically, show people that face a manager rotation at some time, and then construct some control group for those people who don't face a manager rotation. And then you could basically directly see, both for men and women, what's the impact of this manager rotation. And then you could easily plot like a number of different outcomes. And so I would think also about a way of sort of visualizing your results. I think it would have, it's similar, so substantially would be very similar to your regression analysis, but I think it could just make the point much clearer. And then I would have liked to see sort of, more outcomes here, like, not just is there a promotion, but also like hours, where do you move up in the hierarchy? And I think a lot of that could be a bit more visual. So just to wrap up, this part. So I think this is really fascinating data and some really interesting results. I think the surprising results, I would not have thought that the simple shock of manager rotation has such a big impact and seems to erase basically so much of the gender gap. And this is sort of one figure that I think really kind of highlights this, where you hear the people who have experienced the manager rotation, and there really seems to be much fewer gender differences after that. So this is really quite nice. And you mentioned in your talk that you're thinking about doing experiments with the firm to sort of, how can the firm sort of use this knowledge to better promote women's promotion. I think this is, seems like a very fascinating research agenda. Okay, so let me briefly talk about the second paper. So this too is also, I think a really fascinating study. Right, so obviously minimum wages are always a hot policy topic all over the world. Many countries, not just the US. In the US, it's a hot topic on every level, federal level, local levels. So this is just, it's fascinating that this paper finds kind of a really new twist on that I had never really thought about. Namely, this idea that there are employers who basically have decide on their own to institute sort of minimum wages within their company, and then the paper sort of fits into this discussion where we always kind of think about the trade-off between boosting low-skilled workers' pay versus possible employment losses. And I think this, in particular, right now we're at a point in time where the federal minimum wage is kind of at a historical low, right? So the blue line is the real minimum wage, in 2019 dollars, and you can see that it's very low compared to sort of the last 6 decades, basically. And it's unclear whether the new Congress will be able or willing to to raise the minimum wage again. So there's a good chance it might erode further. Now, I think partly because it's so low, there have been a lot of local initiatives to raise the minimum wage on the state level, on the city level, but also, as people point out, on the employer level. And this is really what it focuses on. And in this figure, I thought it's just totally fascinating that you basically have these very large employers who have minimum wages that are substantially above, the vast majority of state level minimum wages, or basically all in the case of Amazon. And then to think about, what does this do to local labor markets? And David showed this nice figure that Amazon seems to not just talk the talk, but it actually walks the walk. So that's really does raise wages for its workers, and this is a pretty dramatic effect. And then the paper says, in some regions, in particular regions where wages are relatively low, this really means that there are a lot of other workers and other firms who are not working, or not Amazon, who suddenly have like this sort of competing firm in the local labor market who pays much higher wages. Then it asks, what do they do? And sort of the key first question is, do competitors respond to this by raising their wages? And then if their equilibrium wage rises, what happens to employment? Right? Does it mean that the competitors hire fewer workers? Does Amazon hire fewer workers? So these are kind of key questions. And then the main design is this event study design that to me seemed extremely reasonable and very well done. And then we have this sort of fascinating figure that we see, as Amazon raises its wage to $15, there's a huge, there's basically an immediate jump in wages that are posted on Burning Glass for other job vacancies, and so it's a very sizable jump. And then you can also see this in the CPS data that there too you see a big increase in minimum wage. So here one comment I had, I thought it would be nice to show like on to basically measure on the regional level what is the fraction of vacancies or jobs that pay less than the $15. Right? So in some ways the question is a little bit like, if this was like a federal minimum wage, right, then presumably nothing is ever 100% binding, but probably like 95% of employers would not pay less than the federal minimum wage, right? And so kind of the question is, how similar is that to the federal minimum wage? And it was not clear to me from reading the paper. Is it that 10% of firms that pay less than $15 now raise their wage to $15, or raise their wage by $2, but maybe to 14 or something? And I thought this is kind of an important question, especially when we think about sort of the relationship to the regulated minimum wage. And then these employment effects, are very interesting. So there's also CPS data, and you can sort of, it's clearly less precise as the wage effect, which most of the minimum wage literature has sort of found imprecise, slightly negative employment effects. So this is very much in line with that, and may just be, because the real effects are very small and negative, and so you can never really. So it's always imprecise relative to where the mean is compared to zero. Now, I thought at this point we can try to think a bit more sort of about mechanisms, right? And here it was not totally clear to me. To some extent, this could be because Amazon might be basically poaching workers from competitors, right? And if I understood this correctly, you're looking at employment, who is not Amazon, right? Maybe I'm missing that, but David's nodding, right? So basically, it could be that, I don't know, Amazon is now paying more wages, and maybe they increased their wages in part because they had a hard time attracting workers. Right? So if you really think about sort of monopsony models, then you might think, okay, they really have struggled with that, and so they now pay a higher wage, and now they're basically the workers who leave. I don't know, they leave Target and then they work for Amazon, and so employment is decreasing for Target, but maybe this is in part just offset by the fact that Amazon has now more workers. And so thinking a bit about these kind of equilibrium questions, I think would be important and quite nice. This figure is also, there are lots of really fascinating figures in this paper, and I was really impressed. So this is basically for each of these kind of shocks, what's the effect on the actual wage, and then the effect on the employment ratio. And I think this is also just showing nicely that as you would expect, if there's a bigger effect on the actual wage, then you have a bigger effect of employment. So this is kind of a labor demand curve, and it's downward sloping, as you would think if you were teaching labor economics to undergrads, right? So this is nice. And then one thought I had here was that I'm sure David knows the $10 minimum wage for federal contractors. That was established in 2014, and wouldn't that be like a very similar sort of shock? I mean, maybe this is before your data starts, at least in the Burning Glass. I wasn't sure, but I thought maybe this would be something to add here, just because it's a bit different in nature, and it's sort of a government decision, but in some ways it's also quite similar.
Johannes, you have about 2 more minutes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I have 2 more slides. So, that's sort of on the theory side. So these are just some very rough thoughts I had, so they're not like super polished, but in a competitive labor market, you would think like, okay, if there's sort of several employers, right, then Amazon increases their minimum wage or their wage, and maybe this could lead to Amazon reducing their employment, although that's depends on sort of what the motivation is for increasing the wage, right? So that's a bit hard to know. But really, in a competitive labor market, this should not affect wages and employment at other firms, I think. Right? So basically, in a competitive labor market, one firm sort of paying a bonus to their workers should not change the equilibrium. That's just sort of like giving away free money. That shouldn't matter. So Now, on the other hand, we are living in 2020. Nobody believes in competitive labor markets anymore. So then the question is what's going on here, right? So clearly, if you have wage bargaining, monopsony, efficiency wage models, then this might sort of increase pressure on other firms to raise their wages. But I just thought here having maybe a bit more sort of theoretical guidance, how to think about this, to what extent can we maybe distinguish between different models, would be quite helpful. I realize this is a little bit vague, but sort of thinking a bit more through the channels here, I thought it could be nice. And then there's also something which I call sort of the PR model, where I thought maybe it's not really about the labor market at all. Maybe it is that Amazon raises their wage, and then kind of big competitors think it looks bad from a PR perspective to pay less than that. Right? So presumably Amazon raised its wage in part because it looks good, right? Because they've gotten a lot of bad publicity, and now they say look, we treat our workers well, right? But now maybe because Amazon does that, it looks bad for Walmart to only pay $12, right? Or that's sort of the kind of thing, right? And so that's kind of then we really have to think a bit outside the box. What does this really mean in terms of what does it imply for labor markets, and also how do we think about the employment effects in that case, right? Because then it may not be, it's just kind of a point I thought you could think a bit more about. And then one thing that also, it's not clear whether this is important in this case, but to some extent it seems like Amazon might be buying services from other firms that are similar. I'm not really sure, but Amazon clearly is for its delivery services, it's relying a lot on contractors, if I understand this correctly, right? And so David being the expert on on domestic outsourcing, I was just sort of thinking, maybe what you're picking up could be a little bit of that, right? That these sort of contractors, and then maybe Amazon is also paying more to these contractors. I don't know. That seems like a possibility. And then the last point is sort of, okay, sorry. The last point is when you think about these sort of employer policies as opposed to the government instituting a minimum wage, then one difference here that really makes it quite different is that in a way an employer-based minimum wage is basically a transfer to workers in low-income regions, right? So if this comes out of sort of Amazon's ridiculously huge revenue, and now they're giving basically a larger share of that to poor rural regions in Florida or Kentucky, then this is basically money coming from the outside, and that's could sort of in itself kind of boost employment in these regions, right? You have sort of workers having high incomes now, spending it. There could be a multiplier effect. Now that I guess would dampen the employment losses, if anything, right? But it is a bit different from a federal minimum wage that says across the board, everywhere we have to pay a higher minimum wage, and then some of that could still be transferred from large employers to that region, but a lot of that sort of wage increase would come from sort of local redistribution as opposed to federal redistribution, and I think that can change the interpretation a bit. So I think it's really fascinating. Maybe just the concluding thought I had was, if you think forward about the next Congress and sort of possible policies, it does sort of raise the question whether basically even inside of a divided Congress, whether policy one arm of the government could basically affect equilibrium wages by simply either pushing the federal contractor minimum wage even higher, or convincing large employers to raise the minimum wage, and then with the spillover effects, this could have a much larger impact than what you would have thought initially, right? So when I first 6 years ago thought about the federal contractor minimum wage, I thought that's fine, but that's it's just sort of a few million workers and that's sort of it, right? But maybe this had sort of much larger impacts that are hard to appreciate, and I think this is kind of a very interesting lens on this. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Johannes. That was great. And next we have a presentation by Nathan Wilmers on consolidated advantage.
Terrific, thanks, and two such cool papers so far. What a great panel that we've got so far. So this is co-authored work with Clem Apley, who's a PhD student at Harvard. Basically, this project started sort of trying to figure out why it is that wage inequality is still increasing. And by still, I mean, we're going to focus on basically the period of the last 20 years. And the reason for that is in part data limitations that I'll mention in a minute, but in part because some of the standard explanations for rising wage inequality that seem to fit pretty well for this earlier period of sort of late 70s through late 90s don't fit as well for the last 20 years. And so maybe the most prominent one of these is that rising education premiums do a pretty good job explaining rising inequality in that earlier period, but they explain about half as much of the rise in inequality more recently. And so two kind of stylized facts that might seem like they would give you an answer to what's going on more recently. One is that rising inequality has mostly been between occupations, which might make you think that, okay, maybe it's not education per se, but it's some sort of idiosyncratic skill associated with a subset of occupations like software engineers or something, and that's driving inequality. Another finding is that basically especially for this later period, all of the rise in inequality has been between workplaces rather than among coworkers at the same workplace. And so that sort of finding might make you think, okay, this is something about the distribution of market power, something about high road versus low road employment strategies. But there's also been some recent work suggesting that you really can't read that much into these kind of basic decompositions of where inequality is rising. One finding is that it seems as though occupations are increasingly segregated across workplaces, which if that's the case, then you might think that some of what we're seeing is sort of between occupation inequality might really be due to the workplaces that they're sorting to. Then similarly, it looks as though high-skilled workers are increasingly matching up to high-skilled employers, which might make you sort of question whether this between workplace inequality is really due to something like rising inequality in workplace premiums, or maybe it just has something to do with this sorting process. So in this project, we use occupational employment statistics microdata to try to get some more leverage on these questions. This is a huge survey that the BLS does of employers asking about their occupational composition and pay rates. And this, I think this is still a pretty underused data source. And the neat thing about it is that it's the only nationally representative occupation by workplace data that we have for the US. So most of the studies of occupational inequality rely on household surveys of workers. You knock on the door, call somebody up, you say, how much are you paid? What's your occupation? You don't get much information about their workplace. On the other hand, studies of kind of workplace-based inequality mostly focus on administrative data that matches workers to firms. Of course, this is sort of new, terrific innovation in studying inequality. But unfortunately for the US, the occupational information that we have for our linked employer-employee data is pretty weak. So that means that for the US at least, the OES kind of offers a unique opportunity to estimate workplace and occupation effects simultaneously. So that's exactly what we do. We basically fit a simple two-way fixed effects model where we end up with a vector of fixed effects for occupation, for workplace, and then a residual component. This lets us do sort of a simple but I think useful variance decomposition where basically you've got a component of inequality that's due to between occupation premiums kind of controlling for the workplaces that they've sorted to. And then the between workplace component ends up being kind of controlling for occupational composition. So getting at whether, like in David's project, whether some of these employers are sort of paying above the basic market rate for the kinds of occupations that they're employing. Then we get within workplace, which is kind of a mix of within job inequality and then also any idiosyncratic premiums associated with a particular workplace for a particular occupation. That's sort of in the residual component. And then finally, we've got kind of this covariance component, which is going to be our focus for the presentation. And so I thought pretty striking findings that we got when we looked at this decomposition are, if you look at the red line, which gives the between occupation premium component, you see it was rising a bit kind of up through the recession, then during the recovery has actually been decreasing. So the net contribution of occupational premium inequality during this period is pretty minimal. No action on rising between workplace premiums. Residual is pretty flat too, but you see this green line of increased correlation between occupation and workplace premiums is really driving the action here. So increasingly, if you have if you're in an occupation that has a high occupation premium, you're also likely to be at a workplace with a high workplace premium. So we sort of dug into a bunch of different kind of mechanical explanations for this. and couldn't really get rid of it with anything simple. So a kind of jumping off point for the rest of the project for us was this chart where we just sort of compared the overall sample of all workplaces that are in the Occupational Employment Statistics Survey. We compared those workplaces to a subset of kind of a panel sample of workplaces that appear both at the beginning and at the end of the OES. You can see that it's a super similar upward trend in both of these sets of workplaces, which led us to believe that this isn't just about kind of firm entry and exit dynamics or some workplaces disappearing, some appearing. Instead, it seems as though that there's some organizational change, even among incumbent workplaces, that's driving kind of this increased correlation between occupation and workplace premiums. So we came up with like a pretty simple, and this is sort of a super descriptive panel-based decomposition approach to try to get a sense of like what kinds of organizational changes are mostly responsible for this increased consolidation between occupation and workplace. And so you can imagine there's just 3 different changes that organizations can make. They can change their occupational composition, upskill or deskill. They can change their workplace premium, or they can grow or shrink, changing the density of employment across this chart. And the impact of any of these changes are really going to depend on where establishments and jobs start in the distribution of occupation by workplace. So just to give you kind of a super simple, concrete sense of what jobs you should be thinking about here, you know, in the bottom left-hand corner, you could think of like a cook who's low in the occupational premium hierarchy and also not benefiting much from workplace premiums at this low-wage restaurant that he's working at. In contrast, in the upper right-hand corner, you could think of like Google software engineers who are getting paid a lot in virtue of both their occupation and also their workplace. But then the kind of off-diagonal jobs here are pretty interesting, where you could imagine a unionized manufacturing facility where it employs a lot of lower skill workers, but there's a pretty high workplace premium attached to that job. And then the final quadrant you could think of as sort of it ends up being a lot of like education, medical services, sort of settings where you get a lot of pretty high-paid occupations, high-skill occupations that are working for nonprofit organizations or other organizations that don't end up paying a lot relative to that occupational composition. Okay, so then we set up this simple descriptive counterfactual where we just like block one of these channels for a subset of organizations, and then we see, okay, how much would the correlation have increased between occupation and workplace if there had been no change for this set of firms. I'm not going to go through in detail how we operationalize all this, but because both David and 2 minutes? Thanks. Because both David and Johannes are on this panel, I wanted to walk through the outsourcing one where basically we prevent high-paying firms from getting rid of their non-routine manual workers. And then we also prevent kind of the classic outsourcing industries, building services, catering, security, logistics. We prevent their employment from expanding. And so we sort of did this for a bunch of different possible explanations that you could think of. And the kind of 2 big things that jump out from this are that both the expansion of kind of high-paid services and finance, consulting, tech, and also rising pay in those sectors, which you could think of as sort of the top team superstar firm type story. That's a big chunk of this, a little more than a quarter. And then also a kind of bifurcation in that social services sector that I mentioned, where some of these educational medical establishments are increasing pay and keeping their high-skilled occupational composition. And then some are keeping their low pay but changing their occupational composition, maybe swapping out a nurse's assistant instead of having a registered nurse. Okay, so the key points here are first that it's really this rising correlation between occupation and establishment premiums that explains the bulk of rising inequality over the last 20 years rather than sort of occupation or workplace premiums alone. We decompose this into a few different channels. Again, the top team star firm story pops out, as does this kind of bifurcation in the social sector, which, at least as far as I know, there's not really been as much focus on that as a possible mechanism driving inequality, and was sort of a interesting surprise to me working on this project. then kind of maybe the simplest upshot of this is that it's really increasingly high-skilled workers who are benefiting from these workplace premiums. It's increasingly not the kind of low-skilled manufacturing worker working at a high-paying manufacturing facility. Increasingly, it's that sort of managers and professionals are benefiting both in terms of their relatively high occupation premium and also that they're at these pretty high-paying workplaces. So thanks. That's it.
Thank you for being very timely. And so finally, we have Siwei Cheng giving discussant comments on Nathan's paper.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, thanks, Nate, for this great presentation, and I really enjoyed reading the paper. I find the paper fascinating because it ties together, the two lines of literature, which I don't think they haven't been in dialogue. Of course, they've been in dialogue, and we talk about, to what extent does each of this dimension, whether it's occupation or workplace, explain inequality. But then this paper, I think it goes one step forward to think about, how, if we think about the two dimensions especially in sociology, we have this cross-cutting dimensions. If you're studying Blau's work, so I like it when we're bringing this to studies of labor market inequality. So I really enjoyed the paper. Another thing I enjoyed is that you have a very clear way of illustrating, because these are complex models, and especially I like it when you delve into these different mechanisms. It's complicated, but then I think it's like from the way that you're kind of writing it up, and you have a clear way of illustrating how different quantities or different models, different quantities and models speak to specific mechanisms that you're talking about, like outsourcing or polarization. So that's another thing that I really liked about this paper. I have some thoughts. So I have two major comments, and then I'll talk about just some random minor thoughts. So the first one is what I call additivity assumption. So basically your model and you mentioned that in your paper, it's kind of additive in the sense that it has three components. One is residual, but the other two are, one is occupation, one is workplace, and you have them added up together. And then this is different from some other work in which people talk about an interaction effect of occupation and workplace. I understand that your emphasis is not the interaction term in the statistical model, but rather the interaction, the association between the two premiums in the design matrix that we see that you feed into the model. So that I think that's a nice point, but I also wonder whether in reality there is an interaction term, which means that the premium of some, say the workplace premium, might differ for occupation, like for people from different occupational status. So I start asking myself this question: what would happen to your estimates if within an establishment, a good workplace is good, but it's even greater for some occupations within that establishment? So, and I'm trying to think, so your beta can be seen as an average premium across workers in that establishment in estimating your model. But if there is heterogeneity, that average will be more heavily weighted among workers that are, if a workplace has a lot of high-end occupation, then it will be more heavily weighted towards those high-end occupation. And if there is in fact an interaction effect, meaning that high-end occupations receive even greater premium from that workplace, then workers of lower occupation status in the same establishment. In that way, wouldn't that automatically also introduce a positive association between workplace premium and occupation premium? Because then your high workplace, high premium workplaces will, if an establishment have a greater proportion of higher end occupation, then that will drive up the average workplace premium, which is your beta WT that you're estimating. So that's just, something that I've been kind of entertaining in my mind. And this could be a mechanism, or I wonder if you can test that, just run an interaction model and to see whether there is some heterogeneity in the premiums. In addition to the only association of your design matrix. So that's my first comment. And the second comment is, I was wondering, so you basically, partly because of the data and also because of your research focus, you focus on these 2 dimensions, but of course there are all these other variables that we can think about that drives premium, workplace premium, as well as occupation premium. So, and I was listening to David's presentation, and that kind of also reminds me of, workplaces tend to cluster in places and their spillover effects, and across occupations, similar occupations or spillover effects across workplaces in a similar region. So could it be that part of the positive association between your alpha and beta be driven by gamma, which is that I'm giving an example, maybe it's regional premium, which is mutually driving these 2 premiums. And this could be another mechanisms behind this increasing positive association, given what we know about this urban agglomeration and this clustering of jobs. And it might be interesting to also look at this by industry. So yeah, so I think that will be an interesting mechanism to test. And then I have some other thoughts. So one quick question is, like in your figure 1 and 2 in the paper, a lot of this increase happened between 2000 and 2005. So maybe, I don't know if you have any explanations or thoughts on, anything in that period that's particularly important. And another thing is, I think you talk about lots of the mechanisms that has been going on. Another thing I'm having in mind is this kind of network nature of organizations. And I know, Nate, you have your work, it's also kind of speaking to this literature. So, just are there some more inter-organizational dynamics that's driving up? So like benchmarking, like say pace in one firm depends on the pace in other firm that is connected to, and that's could it be also driving up this consolidation. And also I'm interested in how, how we would think about mobility, like how, I know this is more cross-sectional data, but, from the individual's perspective, to what extent does mobility play in this cross-sectional inequality. So another thing I've been having, I don't know how the OES data deals with this kind of occupational classification, but could it be like some workplaces are inventing occupational titles? Like, we know that there has been a lot of new jobs going on and new job titles, new types of occupations that bundle together tasks that are not previously introduced in the labor market. So, and so I'm starting to think whether occupation itself is also endogenous to workplace, because high-end and low-end workplaces might be inventing new types of jobs. And then that's basically driving up that, because if that invention are unevenly distributed across different types of workplaces. So that's just a thought about how occupational coding, or just how we think about occupation, will shape your results. 1 minute?
Yeah, we're at time if you can wrap it up.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the last thing is just whether you look at nonlinear correlations. Yeah.
Yeah, great.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. So we have just a very short amount of time for question and answer, but I still want to encourage the people in the audience to submit any questions for any sort of last minute notes on this. And sort of on that note, we do have a couple comments from Alora in responses to Johannes's comments. And so I'll just chime in and speak for her, that she notes that they have done event studies where the outcome is wages less than $15, and they see a big shift out of that category. So they'll include that in future drafts. And they also look at aggregate employment effects that look similar. So David may remember what that is in reference to. That some of these I don't remember exactly what they're in reference to because she submitted them while Johannes was presenting. But they are, part of their future research agenda is to look at federal contractors' minimum wage to see the effects of that. And she really loves your suggestions on theory, Johannes. So she says thank you for that. So do either any of the other presenters want to respond to any of the discussion comments before if there are any audience comments?
Could I just elaborate on one of the ones that Laura was responding to, and in response to Johannes's great observation about mechanisms, which we agree is really an important part of what we're trying to understand. And I think what we're teasing out is that these employers might be in different kinds of, the responses might differ in terms of their own size and their own strategies. So we do test, for instance, whether Target, Walmart, other companies are changing their posting strategies to sort of hide the fact that they don't want to look bad. It's your PR story. We actually don't find that effect in the way we've modeled the data, but something we do want to explore. The other kind of breakpoint we're looking a lot at with a new data set called Homebase, we're interested if the response of very small firms might look more traditional, that they are truly wage takers versus a middle tier of firms, which might have, be operating on a more elastic part of their supply curve and be playing a different game. And that, so the net effect of employment is kind of washing out the fact that you have different mechanisms driving the response of different employers. But thanks for your great comments.
Just one really quick response to Siwei. Thanks so much for those great comments, Siwei. One thing on the interaction term question, part of the residual that we end up with, we can further decompose into like a pure within job variance part, and then something that's like idiosyncratic differences between occupations associated with a given workplace. And that second component kind of gets towards what you're gesturing to. Surprisingly to us, that part of inequality is actually decreasing a bit during this period. The within job part is increasing a little, sort of relevant to Ingrid's project too. So I think that the additive assumption is actually okay for this, and there's not so at least not increasingly job-specific kind of idiosyncratic workplace premiums in these data.
And Johannes, were you also going to chime in with something?
Yeah, I had a comment on David's point, but I just wanted to say related to that, if you could test whether in labor markets where Amazon is big, the minimum wage increase actually led to an increase in employment, there would be very neat evidence for the monopsony model that is kind of lacking in the literature. I mean, apart from some nurses, we really don't know. And it seems like it would be potentially a very interesting national experiment for that. But it's a bit outside of your main, I think, focus. But
yeah, and I have another question for David that follows up from some of what Johannes had said about sort of like the fissured workplace effects of Amazon in the communities they operate in. And I'm not sure whether you can look at employment of Amazon contractors. So things like flex drivers and things like that. The one thing with your data is you may sort of get around with what some of the sort of census survey data misses, is that you don't really know if self-employed workers are independent contractors working directly for one company or not. Like you may be, I don't know if you can get at that in your data and whether you're able to look at whether Amazon's flex drivers are also impacted by these wage impacts.
That's a great question. But for the reason you described, it's hard to get at the flex workers because of, if I were going to editorialize, their inappropriate classification as independent contractors, but I won't go there. But what we do have is information on staffing agencies that are actually working within Amazon distribution centers. And that is information we want to really delve into in the next level of our work to get at some of the fissuring impacts that you're alluding to.
Great, thanks. So we're pretty much at time. So unless anyone has any sort of burning final comments, I want to thank everyone for all these really great presentations and discussant comments, and just sort of note how nicely these all fit together, I think, sort of building this narrative about how firm, organization, and practices are a labor market institution in and of themselves that have sort of all these myriad of effects that each research project goes into, including creating barriers for advancement and fostering misallocation of talent, setting pay norms within surrounding areas, and influencing broad structures of pay inequality across the labor market through this correlation of occupational and workplace pay premiums. So I think they just sort of all really like build exactly what we think is sort of like argument for equitable growth, lowercase e.g. equitable growth, that having firms that sort of operate in more fair ways can lead to sort of positive outcomes, broadly speaking, across the labor market. So I really appreciated all these papers and seeing them all together. And thank you all for your time presenting them. And just a sort of a shout out for everyone who is in the who is watching this, that we also currently have our request for proposals for 2021 out, including and one of the sort of focus questions we have in that is also looking at how the labor market and workplace organization affects whether wage growth is broadly shared. So I think a lot of the questions that come from this panel are things that we're hoping we can address in future grants that are made for the next RFP cycle. So again, thank you everyone. It's been a really great panel.